Imagine being told that you're about to receive a punishment so horrific that condemned criminals would literally beg to be executed instead, pleading with their tormentors to simply end their lives rather than subject them to a fate that would make death seem like a merciful release. Picture a form of punishment so systematically cruel that it was designed not just to cause physical agony, but to completely destroy every aspect of what makes someone human, their identity, their sanity, their connection to reality itself, while keeping them alive for decades to experience every moment of their gradual psychological disintegration. This wasn't a quick torture followed by death, but a carefully engineered form of living hell that could last for 30, 40, or even 50 years, transforming healthy human beings into broken shells who would spend the remainder of their lives begging for the death that would never come. The punishment known as damnatio memoriae, combined with perpetual solitary confinement, represented humanity's most sophisticated attempt to inflict suffering that transcended physical pain and entered the realm of existential horror. Developed by the Roman Empire and later refined by medieval institutions, this wasn't simply imprisonment. It was systematic erasure of a person's entire existence while forcing them to remain alive, to witness their own obliteration from history, society, and human memory. Victims would be sealed in underground cells no larger than coffins, given just enough food and water to survive, and left in complete darkness and silence for decades, while every record of their existence was methodically destroyed above ground. Their names were chiseled off monuments, their faces scraped from paintings, their achievements attributed to others, and their families forbidden from speaking their names under penalty of suffering the same fate. The psychological sophistication behind this punishment reveals how ancient authorities understood that the human mind could be broken more thoroughly and permanently than the human body through carefully applied isolation and identity destruction. The architects of Damnatio Memoriae had observed that people could endure almost any physical torture if they retained their sense of self and connection to others. But that complete social isolation, combined with the knowledge that their very existence was being erased, could drive even the strongest individuals to madness within months. The punishment was specifically designed to attack the fundamental human need for social connection and meaning, creating a form of psychological torture that was far more devastating than any physical torment could ever be. The victims chosen for this ultimate punishment were typically those who had committed crimes against the state or challenged the authority of rulers in ways that threatened the fundamental legitimacy of the power structure. Political rivals, religious dissidents, and military commanders who had fallen from favor were the most common targets, but the punishment was also applied to artists, writers, and scholars whose ideas were deemed dangerous to social stability. What made their fate particularly cruel was that many of these individuals were highly intelligent and creative people who suffered more acutely from isolation and identity erasure than ordinary criminals might have. Their sophisticated understanding of what was being done to them made their psychological torment even more intense and unbearable. The construction of the punishment cells reveals the meticulous planning that went into creating environments specifically designed to maximize psychological suffering while maintaining life indefinitely. These weren't crude dungeons, but carefully engineered spaces that incorporated sophisticated knowledge of human psychology and physiology. The cells were typically built deep underground to eliminate any possibility of human contact or natural light, with walls thick enough to prevent any sound from entering or leaving. The temperature was carefully controlled to cause constant discomfort without being extreme enough to cause death, while the humidity levels were maintained at levels that would promote skin conditions and respiratory problems that would add to the victim's misery without being fatal. The feeding and maintenance systems developed for these punishment cells demonstrate how the authorities were willing to invest enormous resources in keeping victims alive for as long as possible while maximizing their suffering. Food was delivered through slots so small that no human contact was possible, consisting of carefully calculated portions that would maintain basic bodily functions while providing no pleasure or comfort. The meals were deliberately bland and nutritionally minimal, designed to keep victims on the edge of starvation without allowing them to die. Water was provided in similar fashion, often deliberately contaminated with substances that would cause digestive problems and ensure that even the most basic human needs became sources of additional discomfort and humiliation. The systematic erasure of the victim's identity from all historical records required an elaborate bureaucratic apparatus that demonstrates how institutional cruelty could become a form of administrative science. Teams of scribes were employed to search through archives and official documents, removing any mention of the condemned person's name or achievements. Artists and craftsmen were hired to deface statues and paintings, while stonecutters were paid to chisel names off monuments and buildings. The process was so thorough that historians working centuries later would sometimes discover evidence of mysterious gaps in historical records, where important figures had obviously existed, but whose identities had been completely obliterated. The impact on the victims' family members adds another layer of horror to this punishment, as they were forced to participate in their loved ones' erasure or face the same fate themselves. Spouses were required to remarry and take new names, while children were often adopted by other families and forbidden from ever mentioning their original parentage. Family members who showed any sign of grief or attempted to preserve the memory of their condemned relative could themselves be subjected to damnatio memoriae, creating a climate of terror that ensured the victim's complete social death. Some families would hold secret funeral ceremonies for relatives who had been subjected to this punishment, treating them as dead even though they remained alive in their underground cells. The religious and philosophical implications of damnatio memoriae reveal how this punishment was designed to attack not just the victim's present existence, but their hopes for any form of afterlife or spiritual continuity. In cultures that believed strongly in the importance of being remembered by the living, the complete erasure of someone's identity was considered a form of spiritual murder that would condemn their soul to eternal oblivion. The punishment thus combined immediate psychological torture with the promise of eternal damnation, creating a form of suffering that extended beyond death itself. Victims were often told explicitly that their spiritual destruction was as important as their physical and psychological torment. The few documented cases where victims survived decades of this punishment provide heartbreaking insights into the human cost of systematic psychological torture. Those who were eventually discovered by later authorities were often found to be completely insane, having developed elaborate fantasy worlds to escape their reality, or having regressed to childlike states of mental functioning. Many had lost the ability to speak coherently or recognize their own identities, while others had developed severe self-harm behaviors or catatonic conditions that made normal human interaction impossible. The psychological damage was so severe that even when rescued, these individuals could never be restored to normal mental functioning. The economic costs of maintaining the damnatio memoriae system reveal how entire societies were willing to devote enormous resources to inflicting suffering on individual victims, demonstrating the priority placed on psychological revenge over practical considerations. The construction and maintenance of underground cells, the employment of guards and support staff, and the bureaucratic apparatus required for identity erasure represented massive investments that could have funded schools, hospitals, or infrastructure projects instead. Some estimates suggest that maintaining a single damnatio memoriae victim for their entire lifetime cost the equivalent of building and operating a small town, Yet authorities considered this expense justified by the psychological impact on potential dissidents. The techniques developed for preventing suicide among damnatio memoriae victims show how the punishment was designed to deny even the escape that death might provide. Cells were constructed without any objects that could be used for self-harm, while victims were periodically checked to ensure they remained alive and conscious. Some facilities employed physicians whose job was specifically to prevent suicide attempts and to treat any injuries or illnesses that might threaten the victim's life. The cruel irony was that medical knowledge and healing techniques were used not to relieve suffering, but to ensure that suffering could continue indefinitely. Victims who attempted suicide would often have their conditions made even worse as punishment for trying to escape their fate. The legal frameworks that were developed to justify damnatio memoriae demonstrate how sophisticated jurisprudence could be corrupted to serve institutional cruelty rather than justice. Legal scholars wrote elaborate treatises explaining why complete erasure from history was appropriate for certain types of crimes, while judges developed precedents and procedures for implementing the punishment according to precise specifications. The legal process itself became a form of torture, with victims forced to listen to detailed explanations of how their identities would be systematically destroyed while they remained alive to witness their own obliteration. Some legal proceedings would last for months, with the psychological impact of anticipating the punishment becoming almost as devastating as the punishment itself. The international diplomatic consequences of damnatio memoriae practices reveal how this form of punishment became a source of conflict and instability between different political entities. Foreign governments would sometimes refuse to recognize authorities that practiced identity erasure, while diplomatic negotiations would break down over demands to release or acknowledge victims of damnatio memoriae. The reputation for extreme cruelty that developed around institutions practicing this punishment made international cooperation difficult and sometimes led to military conflicts as neighboring powers sought to protect their own citizens from the threat of complete erasure. The punishment thus became not just a tool of domestic control, but a source of international tension and warfare. The technological innovations that were developed specifically to support damnatio memoriae demonstrate how human ingenuity could be systematically applied to perfecting psychological torture. Specialized construction techniques were developed for building cells that would maximize isolation while preventing escape or suicide. Advanced record-keeping systems were created to track the systematic erasure of identities from multiple archives and institutions. Communication systems were developed to coordinate the work of identity erasure across vast bureaucratic networks. These technological advances represented genuine innovations that could have been applied to beneficial purposes, but were instead devoted entirely to inflicting human suffering. The psychological techniques employed by guards and administrators to cope with their role in implementing damnatio memoriae reveal how institutional structures could enable ordinary people to participate in extreme cruelty while maintaining their sense of moral legitimacy. Staff members were taught to view victims as already dead or as enemies of society who deserved whatever suffering they experienced. Elaborate bureaucratic procedures were developed to distribute responsibility for the punishment across multiple individuals, ensuring that no single person felt fully responsible for the victim's fate. Religious and philosophical justifications were provided to help staff members rationalize their participation in systematic torture as service to higher principles of justice and social order. The documentation and record-keeping systems that tracked damnatio memoriae cases provide disturbing insights into how institutional memory could be simultaneously preserved and destroyed depending on the needs of the authorities. While all public records of victims were systematically erased, secret archives were maintained that contained detailed information about their punishment, including their physical and psychological condition, their responses to torture, and the effectiveness of different techniques for breaking their resistance. These secret records were used to refine and improve the punishment system while ensuring that knowledge of its victims could be permanently suppressed if necessary. The few historical instances where damnatio memoriae victims were eventually discovered and released provide evidence of the permanent psychological damage caused by decades of isolation and identity erasure. Survivors were often completely unable to reintegrate into society, having lost the ability to form normal human relationships or engage in meaningful social interaction. Many had developed severe mental illnesses that made independent living impossible, while others had become so institutionalized that they were unable to function outside of controlled environments. The rare cases where victims retained some semblance of sanity often revealed that they had survived by developing alternate personalities or fantasy identities that allowed them to escape psychologically from their circumstances. The gradual abandonment of damnatio memoriae practices came not through humanitarian reform, but through practical recognition that the punishment was economically unsustainable and politically counterproductive. The enormous resources required to maintain the system became increasingly difficult to justify as societies developed more efficient methods of social control and political repression. The rise of centralized bureaucratic states reduced the need for spectacular punishments that served primarily as demonstrations of power, while changing religious and philosophical attitudes made the theological justifications for identity erasure less compelling to educated elites. The modern legacy of damnatio memoriae continues to influence contemporary practices of social ostracism, historical revision, and institutional punishment in ways that reveal the persistence of the psychological mechanisms that made this ancient punishment so effective. Contemporary techniques of cancelling individuals from social and professional networks, while obviously less extreme than ancient practices, draw on the same fundamental understanding of how social isolation and identity destruction can be used to control behavior and eliminate dissent. The digital age has created new possibilities for both preserving and erasing individual identities that echo the ancient tension between memory and oblivion that made damnatio memoriae such a powerful tool of institutional control. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the history of damnatio memoriae reveals the extraordinary human capacity for creating punishments that transcend physical suffering and enter the realm of existential horror, demonstrating that the most sophisticated forms of cruelty are often those that attack the fundamental psychological needs that make life meaningful. The fact that intelligent, educated people could design and implement systems for systematically destroying human identity while keeping victims alive to experience their own erasure shows how institutional authority and ideological commitment can override basic human empathy and moral reasoning. This historical example serves as a powerful warning about the potential for psychological torture to become normalized and systematized when societies prioritize abstract goals over individual human welfare. What do you think about this absolutely terrifying demonstration of how psychological torture can be far more devastating than physical pain, and how entire institutions could be devoted to systematically erasing people from existence while keeping them alive to witness their own obliteration? Can you imagine the psychological horror of knowing that your entire identity was being methodically destroyed while you remained trapped in isolation for decades, unable to die and unable to live? The fact that societies were willing to invest enormous resources in perfecting this form of existential torture really makes you wonder about the human capacity for cruelty when it's given institutional support and ideological justification, doesn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments about how the principles behind damnatio memoriae might be operating in more subtle forms in our contemporary world, and what safeguards might be necessary to prevent similar forms of systematic psychological destruction. If you found this investigation into humanity's most sophisticated form of psychological torture as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about the darkest chapters of human history that reveal uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, memory, and institutional cruelty. Ring that notification bell because our next deep dive will explore another historical horror that demonstrates how human creativity can be turned toward perfecting suffering rather than preventing it. Trust me, these stories will change how you think about the relationship between civilization and systematic cruelty forever.